Alright, YouTube, it's time for another occult video, this time on psychedelic spirituality, and the sort of companion to this general line of reasoning is the book that I'm actually writing. I'm 130 pages in now. It's going fairly quickly because I, again, edit as I go. And this time it's in a much better format, so hopefully it will be an interesting work. I'm going to briefly read several pages from the actual work. See, I'm the author, so I get to do that and not infringe my own copyright, since it's not Amazon's KDP Select. Therefore, I get free reign over the material. The basic premise is that psychedelics, or more appropriately, mind-altering substances in general, have intertwined not just in a cursory manner with human spirituality. I know that there's the stoned ape theory and things of that nature, but that it goes far deeper, that some of the spiritual archetypes not normally necessarily associated directly with psychedelics can have a completely psychedelic connection. There's also the facet of, if you look at moralism, ascetic sort of beliefs within modern culture, as they're applied in a social or political context, usually, to psychedelics. Generally, all drugs are seen as poisonous, toxic, evil, harmful, addictive. They'll destroy your life in some way. And part of this passage details that if that is in fact the case, if we're talking more about poisons and we're simply considering what are generally used as drugs as a type of poison that happens to have an entertaining result for some individuals who use it, then that opens up even an entirely new realm when it comes to the psychedelic experience, as you may term it, in regards to spirituality, because then there would be tales, any sort of historical tales that take on any importance within a human context and the human timeline. Anytime somebody gets poisoned, well, it's essentially the same thing. By their own token, when they're talking about drugs, as if they're all evil and deadly and inevitably in time destroy the life of the user. You can then say, okay, well, if that's the case, then all of these other tales of poisoning from antiquity especially, I guess, are simply part of that same importance that it's had an impact on the human timeline throughout history, into the present era as well. It's my belief that psychedelics especially, but mind-altering substances in general, have had more of an effect upon human development than anything else. In fact, I might as well just read these several pages here and not get more into it. So let me begin here, and so I'll be reading. If I make a few errors, it's not because there are errors in the text so much as I'm not used to reading longer passages on video, so here it goes. Many people choose to refer to all psychotropics as poisons because their effect, they perceive, is meant to discourage ingestion. We may rather say that the effects of a species like Psilocybe cubensis works in reverse, often growing in cow pastures where ample moisture is available and plenty of warmth present for the fungus to grow and blossom into its reproductive state. In such a case, perhaps the effects are actually a reproductive mechanism in which the species ingesting it wishes to acquire more of this strange fungus, thus perpetuating its lineage, as undigested spores create first hyphae, and then more recognizable above-ground reproductive mushrooms themselves having survived digestive processes. However, let us instead presume that the moralists are correct. Do we then get to claim all other botanically informed tales of the ingestion of poison as part of the great archetype of psychedelic legend, even where the effects were deadly and not necessarily hallucinogenic? If this is the case, Alexander's likely consumption of hellebore and subsequent death, or his drinking, which is more strictly mind-altering and also may have ended his life, is one more tale we can add to the lexicon of psychotropic non-fiction. In the same vein of thought, we might regard the death of one Roman Emperor Claudius, who is said to have been fed poisonous mushrooms, probably Amanita phalloides, or the death cap, in place of the Caesar's mushrooms, or Amanita caesarea, he was apparently fond of. This poisoning, it is said, was conceived by his wife Agrippina, who crowned Nero emperor and generally had a reputation for killing or exiling anything standing in her way of power. Laughably, Nero likely later had her killed for being too domineering, eliminating his own mother, who had herself killed her own husband. Accounts vary, and this may be more gossip or dramatic effect than reality, but Claudius, who is considered a decent leader, despite his stuttering ways and strange entrance into the role of emperor, of course, he was elected in a de facto sense by the Praetorians after basically everybody else in the lineage was slaughtered and assassinated. He was considered sort of a court jester figure, believe it or not. Was indeed poisoned as all accounts state, and mushrooms are likely the cause. Yet another example where a species which is definitively hallucinogenic and simply so toxic to humans that it is never used as such for these properties, affected world history on a mass scale. For Nero never would have been emperor at all had Claudius survived. This likely would have changed the fate of the Roman Empire on a deep level, likely slowing down its demise, as Nero was perhaps one of 3 or 4 of the truly hated emperors, along with the insane Caligula, and later, after the fall of the western half of the empire, the dubious Justinian, who was an able leader but caused widespread outrage for his taxation policies and embarked upon a disastrous effort to retake the Italian peninsula and North Africa. Of course, he managed to retake them, then the plague hit, and he had so overstretched his funds and his men that everything sort of fell to shit. May not have happened if he hadn't been engaged in warfare for several years. It's an important point because it all roots back to Claudius being killed by poisonous mushrooms and Nero ending up on the throne. Nero, by the way, fiddled while Rome burned in probably a literal sense. There are many other archetypal facets found within ancient cultures which generally relate to some aspect of spirituality or mysticism, of course, and not all are definitively related to the consumption of psychotropic substances. Astrologically significant structures exist in almost every part of the world and often perform strangely similar functions despite these cultures, supposedly having no communication for tens of thousands of years. This is why the archaeological timeline, as usually regarded, makes relatively little sense. For if the human race in the very early days of hominid development had already fractured due to migration, and these prehistoric migratory populations diverged and developed apart from one another with no communication, why do they all appear to have developed roughly the same ideas over time, such as selective breeding of plants, horticulturalism, and megaliths of an astronomical type? The same is true for the consumption of psychedelic plants and fungi, occasionally animals as well, such as the 5-MeO-DMT containing Bufo alvarius, and there's another scientific name, it's sort of like San Pedro, or Colorado river toad. Why did all of these cultures eventually incline themselves towards the ingestion of such substances? See, the confusion is essentially this. Why would they go out of their way to consume substances that in some cases were harmful to their overall health? Certainly, if they had an idea of cause and effect, they would have known this. Why then did they consume them? We may theorize several answers to the psychedelic question. We may first, of course, assume that the use of mind-altering species predates divergence, that is, that they were in widespread use, and we simply don't have evidence of it because it's, prehistoric times, before they diverged, sort of out of Africa or wherever you consider them to have diverged from. If dolphins, as it is now known to be the case, are sophisticated enough to deliberately seek out and nibble at pufferfish to enjoy the apparently mind-warping effects it gives them, would not even the most primitive hominid groups be capable of comprehending the same? Of course, yes. Surely, when we in modernity regard more primitive man as utterly debased, hairy, stooped over and dragging a crude wooden club, we probably make a severe mistake, for if they could craft simple stone tools, they already had some comprehension of cause and effect. Literally, for the tools that is, I strike this chunk of rock which looks a certain way against a bigger rock, and the resulting form is better able to kill or skin animals. As flint and obsidian flakes come into use, it's presumably possible that they were also making crude pelts for clothing also. If the use of such substances predates divergence, as I believe is quite likely, then this neatly explains most of the other strange phenomena of the period. Strange, ghastly, otherworldly cave paintings become hallucinations put to art, and tales of sky people may be less reality in the physical sense than visions seen while imbibing some sort of drug. So too do tales of shapeshifters and monsters seem easily explained if the same tribal hominids were regularly using drugs. We know that crude alcohol was already being ingested fairly early in the human timeline, which should have been obvious since even animals can learn to wait until fruit has begun to foam with alcohol to ingest it. It is also possible that there is some innate tendency in man to ingest such things, because the similar pre-existent tendency to experiment upon man's surroundings through cause and effect. A population coming across the Bering Land Bridge, this is a slightly important point, as most mainstream archaeologists agree occurred, would likely have faced difficult conditions in the mountainous forests of what is now British Columbia, down into Washington State, Idaho, and Oregon. This area is relatively cool, very wet, and at the time was populated by large numbers of bears and other predators. While the predators were probably tasty to the people migrating, the people were also tasty for the bears. It is difficult to envision a small half-starved population of migrant nomads deciding to ingest those funny little... not difficult to envision. Deciding to ingest those funny little red mushrooms with white speckles. Perhaps when they did, they developed a deeper connection with their early conception of the spiritual. Man in the early days frequently faced the need to experiment to find food sources. There were no books to tell the species which plant and fungi were edible, and animals were not always readily available for hunting, although meat was certainly consumed. Occasionally, psychotropics would have been ingested by accident alone. And when strange things were then seen by the ones who had ingested them, it's likely they encouraged others to eat the same material and see what they had seen. We might even imagine, another good point here, we might even imagine squabbles roughly equating to modern religious fighting, erupting when two members of the tribe saw different hallucinations using the same substance and had little in the way of describing why they hadn't simply seen the exact same beings or forces while partaking. You would think of one caveman takes the mushroom and sees magical bears, the other one sees magical foxes. They look like creatures that they've seen, but to them they seem magical. Well, maybe they're going to start worshipping them. Are you going to end up with two warring cults, the cult of the bear and the cult of the fox? You could theoretically have something like this happen, and I think probably did happen. Indeed, while primitive communism never existed, there was a primitive tendency, it seems, in early man and probably his hominid forebears, literally primitive drug cults which spawned or influenced all early spirituality and culture. Even the design of primitive settlements point within archaeology, as it were echoed by those encountered in the undeveloped world into the colonial era, appears to share astronomical design, often a large central hut, or building or monument around which others were often gathered in a circular design. Only later, as logic and order are regarded in antiquity, in an academic sense that is, does the modern grid system develop and get put into widespread use where it's feasible. So then we have two equally valid explanations for the widespread use of psychotropics by all cultures, that their use was discovered before substantial divergence, and the usage continued as divergence occurred, or that the harsh realities of life faced by all divergent groups eventually led to them all sporadically encountering such substances, after which their use became first recreational and then perhaps ritualized. We may then wonder if in the latter case ritualism or entertainment came first. Surely when we regard animals imbibing such substances, they're not associating it with ritualism or putting great thought into it. It is merely an interesting experience to them and has become habitual. In some species, as before with dolphins or jaguars, which have been observed to ingest chacruna and fall into a sort of trance, catnip on steroids of a sort. It's a true story, too, which you don't learn this as a kid. It seems thus much more sensible to say that unless early humans were visited by aliens, which fed them drugs as a joke or a form of experimentation, then early man saw no spirituality in the substances he used, and this came later as greater mental and organizational capacity developed. Up until that point, it was the same as how alcohol would have been viewed, and baskets of leaves or mushrooms were seen as a way to alleviate boredom, perhaps. The boredom associated with long nights spent sheltered in a yurt or a cave because a pack of dire wolves was outside, or it was too cold to go hunt and gather berries, or too hot and dry and sunny, or any of a number of other deleterious states which would have driven temporary sedentary behavior, as with how early man into antiquity diverged into those whose understanding of reality itself hinged on temperate or tropical weather patterns, respectively cold and warm seasons or wet and dry seasons. It's the same basic principle anyway. Based on the weather and developed thus, perhaps psychedelics follow a similar mannerism. One thing that cannot be easily explained solely by psychotropic ingestion in early man, of course, is why all of these cultures appear to have similar tales of sky people or flying humans or star-dwelling gods. Ancient astronaut aficionados have their own feelings on the subject, which are perhaps as good as any, and those leaning more towards psychotropics as the root of human spiritual beliefs may find it difficult to explain how such precise megaliths as the pyramids were created by people who only recently before had done little but stack irregularly shaped mud bricks into crude dwellings while attempting to farm the desert. So there's a little bit of a passage from that. Let me click back to my webcam here so I know I'm still centered. It hasn't turned off. I personally choose to believe that psychedelics have had a far greater impact on human civilization than most. A lot of people seem to isolate it. They look at psychedelics, they look at the use of mind-altering substances as simply one, sometimes minor facet of the equally, maybe major facet of human culture, but one of many, which is religion. They would subdivide human culture as it developed into religion and society, which is sort of intertwined with religion, and then the offshoot sort of politics, engineering, agriculture, technology, things like that. They would make these basic classifications and then break them down further. Psychotropics, as used by early man, whether you're talking about antiquity or like early hominids, it makes no difference, usually gets subcategorized into one or more of these groups. It's seen as only one small parcel. But what if we're actually looking at it the wrong way? What if there isn't a major grouping of different facets of human culture leading to all of these smaller facets? What if there's one overarching facet that leads to all others? I would call this the capability of man to observe cause and effect. From that, everything stems. Psychedelic usage, in turn, spawns religion. It spawns the conception of spirituality. The psychedelics come first. They are penultimate in that. I believe that there was no sense of spirituality beyond simply, I exist, I'm here in nature, let's go find food, until man began to discover such substances, because the things that people would have habitually seen in day-to-day life, in their normal existence, would have been trees or steppe, or the shoreline. They would have encountered various food sources. They would have, been breeding, mating, having sex, attempting to find shelter during a storm, and this is basically their existence. Their technology was limited. If we presume, though, as I believe is very likely the case, based on observing the animal world as well, from which humans come as hominids, if we presume that they fairly quickly realize some plants and fungi and perhaps animals as well had what we would consider a psychotropic effect upon the human mind, it makes perfect sense that this would have been continually used. They may have sought out additional materials to test them. They would have eventually been quite adept at knowing which species were psychotropic, as well as, and this is the other component of that, knowing what was edible, which was important for their survival. They had to know all of the species they were capable of consuming safely. During the process of gathering such materials, which had to take on an experimental quality, they necessarily would have encountered some of these other substances, especially if you're talking about pre-divergence. You're talking about parts of Africa, parts of the Middle East, essentially, and southern Europe, this general sort of crescent of region, the Fertile Crescent as well. You're talking about this general region. What kind of species would you find there? Amanita muscaria in some of the higher elevations. Psilocybin certainly would have been quite common in many of these places. Iboga, perhaps. Some of these other, you might have found marijuana occasionally in some of these regions if you look a little further to the east. And of course, there may have been more species present, in fact, species that may no longer exist, extinct species that might have been psychotropic, or patches of species that are no longer extant in that region due to changes in climate, due to overharvesting. We might imagine that, like early man is indicated as possibly having driven some of these animal species to extinction fairly early. We're talking about the mastodon or the giant sloth. It's possible overharvesting, a plant can't fight back in the same way. Overharvesting would have been a concept that they would not have been familiar with. To them, it would be, well, we just keep moving and we'll find more, because they were nomadic for the most part. Once they exhausted all localized resources, they could have locally driven a species to extinction. Multiple tribes operating in different areas could have driven a great many species extinct potentially, simply through harvesting them indiscriminately. And understand the concept that you needed to be. They didn't even have an agricultural concept yet. They were hunter-gatherers at the time, nomadic hunter-gatherers. They would not have had a concept of, well, leave a few of these flowers behind so they can continue spreading and we can get more of them. They didn't have such a concept. They may have had a generative concept when it came to animals, not so much plants. And if we're looking at post-divergence, then it's definitely cause and effect, because you would have to presume that that innate quality of man is why all of these different cultures, having diverged before they started using any of these substances largely, they all took it up. They all found these different substances. What could cause this? Starvation, the necessity of finding new food resources, experimentation, boredom, any of a number of things. Perhaps they considered it medicinal. A way to get spirit guides or something like that to intercede on their behalf. It doesn't really matter. My point is essentially, I believe that psychedelics directly inform human spirituality, that much of the religion we have today is simply the heavily transmogrified version of psychedelic trances that were had by people in early antiquity. That's where these religions spawned. And this can coexist, by the way, with other theories. It could coexist with the concept of very real deities or ancient astronauts or anything like this. It's simply a component, a counterpart to that. You can consider those real if you want, but certainly psychedelics played a role in man's development. It continues to play a role now. Many scientists, innovators, have used drugs, and they have weird ideas while they're doing it. And then they perpetuate this in their science or their theories, their inventions or whatever. This was happening then too. Of course, they didn't have a concept of the same kind of science and logic and reason that we have today, but they had the law of cause and effect pretty much down. Otherwise, they would have gone extinct as a species. Even animals understand it to a dim degree and will learn over time to avoid certain things, to seek out certain things, to do certain things, and not do certain things. That's cause and effect. They understand the concept. They don't have a term for it. They don't understand the concept of concepts. But the basic principle is still there. It would have been present as well in hominids, and probably to a sophisticated degree by the time of the Neanderthals, at least, I would think, if people were wandering around making woodwind instruments and carving pipes anyway. What do you think they were using the pipes for? I choose to believe it probably goes far further back than that. Probably several million years ago, hominids were already choosing to ingest such substances. By the way, if we presume the likelihood that early man ate a lot of wild grains, he may also have been poisoned occasionally by ergot. Ergot, as in where LSD is processed from. Ergotamine poisoning, of course, is much different from LSD usage, but it's still there. It's a parasite, a fungus that grows on certain grain crops, wheat, rye, sorghum to a lesser extent, not on corn. So it would have been present basically in the same areas, these sort of patchy grasslands. The patchy forest theory is now more dominant than the grasslands theory, but there would have been wild grasses anyway there. They could very well have been ingesting the occasional dose of ergot while human development was happening. And so there's a little bit about psychedelic spirituality. I know this is kind of a scattered, rather long now, video. but it requires a little bit of in-depth thought. If you've studied archaeology at all, anthropology in general as well, then you start to get the view that all of these sort of spiritual synchronicities really do revolve to some degree around the ingestion of mind-altering substances. It seems rather key, almost central to the entire spiritual experience. And it's still done to this day, of course. People still practice shamanism. They still ingest these substances ritualistically. It's not a stretch of the imagination to believe that ancient man was doing the same. That's about all. Peace out.